Look at the skyline of 1893 Chicago, a sprawling, marble-white empire of massive domes, Roman columns, and shimmering lagoons rising out of the marshland. We are told this white city was built by frontier settlers in just 24 months, using nothing but hand tools, horse-drawn wagons, and wooden scaffolding. Does that sound like a feat of engineering? Or a tale of architectural impossibility? How does a town of muddy log cabins transform into a Greco-Roman masterpiece of 600 acres and 200 buildings overnight? History says these were temporary stage sets, but the high-resolution photos tell a different story, one of weathered stone and ancient grandeur. Was Chicago truly built by us? Or was it found and renovated? The history books offer one version, but the stones of Chicago suggest we inherited the remains of a lost global empire. The official narrative of Chicago's rise sounds like a miracle of American grit. We're told that in 1833, a handful of pioneers settled in a swampy, desolate marshland. Just 37 years later, this tiny outpost had supposedly transformed into a global industrial powerhouse with an architectural profile that rivaled the grandest capitals of Europe. But what if the growth we see in the history books wasn't an expansion at all? What if it was a massive excavation and rebranding project? Alternative researchers point to a different map, one that doesn't show a blank wilderness, but a sophisticated global empire known as Tartaria. This theory suggests that a technologically advanced civilization existed until the mid-19th century, and only to be wiped out by a cataclysmic Great Reset. In this view, the grand neoclassical buildings of Chicago aren't the products of horse and buggy settlers, but the inherited remains of an older, superior culture. Chicago wasn't just a city being built, it was a strategic hub of a lost world. To understand why this sounds like science fiction, we first have to look at the official history and the cracks that start to appear the moment you look closer. Was Chicago a miracle or a reoccupied ruin? The official timeline of Chicago is one of the most aggressive narratives in modern history. In 1833, Chicago was a tiny settlement of roughly 300 people. By 1890, it was the second largest city in America. We are told that in just 60 years, a group of frontiersmen transformed a swamp into a marble-white Roman empire. And think about the sheer speed of that industrialization. The Big Four architects, Daniel Burnham, Frederick Law Olmsted, Charles McKim, and Richard Morris Hunt, supposedly coordinated the construction of the 1893 World's Fair. This project covered over 600 acres and featured over 200 massive neoclassical buildings. History claims this was accomplished in just 2 years. That means designing, excavating, and completing one massive ornate palace every 3 to 4 days. And all of this was supposedly done with horse-drawn wagons, hand tools, and manual labor. Does that timeline feel realistic, or does it feel like a cover story? When you look at high-resolution photographs from the 1890s, the official explanation becomes even more problematic. Architects tell us these buildings were temporary structures made of staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris and hemp fiber. They claim that these were just stage sets, designed to be torn down after the fair. But look at the intricate friezes, the massive domes, and the weathered stonework in the photos. Researchers argue that the artistic detail and the sheer mass of these structures suggest permanent, pre-existing stone. Why would a fledgling nation spend millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours carving temporary masterpieces that rival the Parthenon? Then we have the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. The official story blames Mrs. O'Leary's cow for a blaze that supposedly leveled 3 square miles of the city. But there's a strange coincidence that the history books rarely mention. And on the exact same night, October 8th, simultaneous great fires broke out in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and Holland, Michigan. How does a cow in a Chicago barn cause firestorms across three different states at the same time? Evidence suggests these weren't accidental house fires. The heat was so intense that stone and brick buildings, structures that shouldn't even burn, melted into slag. Some researchers believe these fires were actually a coordinated demolition of old world infrastructure. It was a great reset in a real time. They needed a clean slate to build a new narrative, and they used fire to erase the evidence of the previous civilization. They told us the fire destroyed the old Chicago, so they could build the new one. But what if the fire was simply used to explain away the disappearance of Tartarian technology they couldn't replicate? They claimed they were rebuilding a city from the ashes. But as we'll see, they weren't just rebuilding, they were digging things up. If the fire wasn't an accident, it was a mass demolition, a clean slate for a new story. But they forgot to hide what was buried directly beneath the street. If you want to see the most glaring contradiction in Chicago's history, you have to look at the ground beneath your feet. Between 1854 and 1860, the city underwent a feat of engineering so massive, it sounds like a tall tale. It's called the Raising of Chicago. The official story, documented by engineers like Ellis S. Chesbrough, claims the city was built too low in a swamp. To install a modern sewer system, they supposedly used thousands of jack screws to lift entire city blocks, including massive stone hotels, several feet into the air. Take a look at the photographs from this era. You see enormous masonry buildings suspended on wooden beams, while people walk into what are supposedly new second-story entrances. The mainstream explanation is that they jacked up the buildings to build the roads higher. But Tartarian researchers see something entirely different in these images. They see a mudflood recovery effort. They believe a global cataclysm, a literal flood of earth and sediment, partially buried the first floors of an existing civilization. Look at the basement windows of almost any pre-1900 building in Chicago's Loop. You'll see full-sized ornate windows that are half buried in the dirt, staring into the foundation. Why would an architect in the 19th century spend time and money installing beautiful, arched windows that look directly into a wall of soil? It makes no sense, unless those basements were actually the original ground floors. The raising of Chicago wasn't a triumph of engineering. It was a massive excavation of a buried past. And then, there is the mystery of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Commonly known as the White City, this event was the ultimate showcase of supposedly temporary architecture. But look at the court of honor in the official photographs by C.D. Arnold. The scale is breathtaking. These aren't just buildings, they are electrical hubs. The 1893 fair featured the first large-scale use of alternating current, powered by George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla. And at a time when most Americans were still reading by candlelight, the White City was ablaze with over 100,000 incandescent lamps. The official story says they built massive steam-powered dynamos to generate this light. But some researchers ask a more provocative question. Where were the wires? Early photos of the fair show remarkably few power lines for a site using more electricity than the entire city of Chicago at the time. Was the architecture itself, the massive domes, the metal spires, and the ornate obelisks, actually harvesting atmospheric energy? The geometry of these star-fort-style layouts suggests a sophisticated understanding of energy resonance. In fact, if you look at the 1850s city plats from the Library of Congress, you'll find something even more startling. that these maps show sophisticated urban grids and geometric star shapes in the surrounding geography that predate the arrival of heavy industry. The maps suggest that the footprint of a great city was already there long before the pioneers arrived with their log cabins. It looks less like a frontier town and more like a strategic grid for a global power network. We're told the settlers planned this city in the mud, but the evidence suggests they were simply coloring within the lines of a pre-existing blueprint, a blueprint left behind by a civilization that knew how to pull power from the very air around them. The official history says Chicago was a miracle of modern progress, but the physical evidence tells a story of a city that was excavated, not built. It was a takeover disguised as an invention. The timeline looks more like a military occupation than a construction project. They weren't just building a city, they were rebranding an empire. And if you think the architecture was just a coincidence, you haven't seen the global connection yet. The evidence isn't just in the photos, it's in the timeline of a global cleanup. A timeline that suggests Chicago was just one piece of a much larger global puzzle. When you step back from the local history of Illinois and look at the global stage, the miracle of Chicago begins to look like a scripted event. If you compare the neoclassical buildings of 1890s Chicago to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, Russia, or the grand administrative halls of colonial Melbourne, Australia, a startling pattern emerges. They are identical. The same massive domes, they're the same Corinthian columns, the same intricate friezes of gods and celestial symbols. How does the official architectural style of a frontier town in the American Midwest look exactly like the architecture of a 1,000-year-old European empire? Mainstream historians call this Beaux-Arts, or neoclassical revival. They tell us that architects across 5 continents all coincidentally decided to mimic ancient Rome at the exact same moment in history. But Tartarian researchers ask a more logical question. What if they didn't mimic it? What if they all inherited it from a single, unified global civilization? This is the core of the Tartaria hypothesis. It suggests that before the mid-19th century, a vast, technologically advanced empire spanned the entire globe. This civilization didn't use national borders as we know them. They were unified by a shared architectural language and a shared source of power. Look at the white city lampposts and the soaring metal spires on Chicago's old cathedrals. In the official story, these are just ornamental or religious decorations. But in the Tartarian view, this is antiquitech. These structures weren't designed for aesthetics. They were functional capacitors and antennas for harvesting atmospheric electricity. Think about the sheer volume of power required to light the 1893 World's Fair. The history books credit Tesla and Westinghouse, but Nikola Tesla himself often spoke of extracting energy from the ether. Was Tesla truly inventing new systems at the Chicago Fair? Or was he attempting to reverse engineer the old world tech he found already embedded in the ruins? Some researchers believe the massive domes of the 1893 palaces were actually part of a wireless power grid, a grid that provided free, clean energy to the entire Tartarian world. If this is true, it changes everything we know about the 19th century. It means the victors of a global conflict didn't just win a war, they executed a great reset. Between 1850 and 1920, the old world of Tartaria was systematically dismantled. The fires in Chicago, Boston, and San Francisco weren't tragic accidents. They were tactical cleanups designed to destroy the free energy infrastructure that couldn't be metered or taxed. The old world was decentralized. It was built on abundance. And the new world, the world we live in now, is built on centralized control, fossil fuels, an artificial scarcity. They couldn't let the public know that the White City could power itself for free. So what did they do? They held a massive World's Fair to show off the buildings one last time, rebranded them as temporary plaster sets, and then burned or demolished them the moment the gates closed. It was a giant estate sale of a dead civilization. They told us they were modernizing the world, but they were actually downgrading it. They replaced atmospheric energy with coal-burning plants and tangled webs of copper wire. They replaced the beautiful, resonant stone of the Tartarians with cheap, disposable materials. And they replaced a global, unified history with a fragmented story of competing nations and lone genius inventors. The Big Four architects weren't masters of design. They were masters of propaganda. Their job was to put a Made in America sticker on a city that had been standing for centuries. They didn't just take the buildings, they took the history and locked it behind the doors of academia. Today, if you question the timeline, you're told that you're architecturally illiterate. But the physical evidence is still there, hiding in plain sight. When you see a star fort layout in an old map or a buried window in a Chicago basement, you aren't seeing a quirk of construction. You are seeing the fingerprints of the people who were here before us. They want us to believe that our ancestors were primitive, struggling in the mud until the Industrial Revolution saved them. But the architecture of Chicago suggests the opposite. It suggests we are living in the ruins of a golden age, walking through streets we no longer know how to build. And the most terrifying part, the people who inherited this empire are still in charge. They work very hard to make sure you don't look too deep into your own basement or ask too many questions about that cow in 1871. Because if you realize that the city was already here, you'll realize the power, the real power, has always belonged to the people. They didn't just build over Tartaria. They built a cage of lies over our collective memory to keep us from realizing what we've lost. But as the ground continues to shift, the truth is beginning to surface. In the next section, Dee will look at how this suppression continues today and the modern discoveries that the official story can no longer explain. If this civilization was so grand, why don't we see more of it today? The answer lies in what researchers call the demolition loop. The official story of the 1893 World's Fair ends with a convenient tragedy. Almost immediately after the gates closed, a series of mysterious fires gutted the White City, providing a perfect excuse to demolish the remaining structures. We are told these were temporary buildings, yet the demolition required massive crews and months of labor to clear. Why destroy a city that could have housed thousands? The answer is simple. You cannot have permanent evidence of a superior past if you want to sell a narrative of primitive ancestors. This cycle of destruction continues into the modern era. Look at the Chicago Landmarks Commission. How many old-world stone buildings are suddenly declared structurally unsound the moment people start questioning their origins? They are replaced by glass boxes and steel frames. Architecture that is designed to fail within 50 years, ensuring the cycle of rebuilding and profit never ends. But the Earth itself is starting to betray the secret. In recent years, massive infrastructure projects in the Chicago Loop have revealed startling anomalies. Construction crews repairing old water mains frequently uncover entire street levels, complete with cobblestones, trolley tracks, and brick storefronts, buried 10 to 15 feet below the current asphalt, and mainstream archaeology calls these light wells or vaulted sidewalks. They claim the city was simply raised for sanitation. But look at the craftsmanship of these subterranean levels. Why would a 19th century city, struggling with basic survival, build ornate, finished stonework in a sewer trench? In 2017, workers in the West Loop discovered buried tunnels that were far more sophisticated than the official blueprint suggested. These weren't just sewers. They were lined with high-quality brickwork that showed no signs of 19th century soot or wear. These discoveries are often quickly covered up, the sites sealed with concrete, and the workers sworn to NDAs. The official story is reinforced by academic gatekeeping. If a historian or architect questions the staff and plaster narrative of the 1893 fair, they risk losing their credentials. They are told they are conflating styles or simply don't understand Beaux-Arts revivalism. But the label Beaux-Arts is just a linguistic curtain. It's a way to categorize the impossible, so we stop looking at it. The narrative is reinforced through standardized history books that emphasize the temporary nature of the fair, making sure every schoolchild believes the White City was a miracle of American theater, not a recovered Tartarian capital. Who benefits from this silence? The same institutions that own the energy grids, the land, and the history books. They know that if we realize these buildings were part of a free energy network, their entire economic model, based on charging you for every kilowatt hour, would collapse overnight. This isn't just a theory about old buildings, and it's about the active modern suppression of human potential. They didn't just bury the first floors, they buried the truth about what we are capable of as a species. And as we'll see, this hidden history has a direct impact on the world you're living in right now. Why does the mystery of a century-old city matter to us in the digital age? Because the history of Chicago isn't just a story about bricks and mortar. It is a story about the energy that powers our lives. If the Tartarian hypothesis is correct, the White City wasn't just a beautiful architectural achievement, it was a functional machine. Researchers believe the massive spires and copper-domed roofs were part of a sophisticated grid designed to harvest atmospheric electricity. The mathematical potential for this is undeniable. The potential difference in our atmosphere increases with altitude, following a specific physical law. Phi equals the integral of E dot dl. By building soaring, metallic conductors high into the sky, the Tartarians may have been tapping into a limitless, wireless power source. Imagine a world where electricity was as free as the air you breathe. No power lines, no monthly utility bills, and no reliance on fossil fuels. When the victors took over Chicago in the late 1800s, they didn't just tear down buildings. They dismantled a way of life. They replaced free atmospheric energy with a monopoly on coal, oil, and gas. They turned a world of abundance into a world of artificial scarcity. Every time you pay an electric bill today, and you are paying the price of the Great Reset. We are living in a society that is technologically tethered by design. We use wires because wires can be metered. We use fuel because fuel can be taxed. This suppression has created a profound identity crisis. By erasing the evidence of a global unified civilization, the current power structure has kept us divided by manufactured national borders and competing histories. They want us to believe we are the most advanced humans to ever live, even though we can no longer replicate the stone carving or the energy harvesting techniques of the 1890s. We have been raised to believe that progress is a straight line moving upward. But when you look at the buried windows of Chicago, you realize that progress might actually be a cycle of loss and recovery. We aren't building the future. We are struggling to remember a past that was taken from us. So, the next time you walk down Michigan Avenue, look up at the spires, and then look down at the sidewalk. You aren't just walking through a modern city. You are walking on the roof of a giant that is waiting to be rediscovered. The stones of Chicago don't lie, even if the history books do. When we look at the impossible timeline of the 1893 World's Fair, The melted ruins of the 1871 fire and the buried windows of the loop, a different story emerges. It is a story of a grand global inheritance, a civilization called Tartaria that understood the Earth's energy in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. Chicago wasn't built in a day by pioneers in mud-caked boots. It was excavated, rebranded, and repurposed by the victors of a forgotten conflict. History, as they say, it is the lie agreed upon. But the physical evidence remains beneath our feet and above our heads. We are the inheritors of a world we've been taught to forget. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you seen mud flood windows in your own city? Do the old stone buildings in your town have a history that just doesn't add up? Leave a comment below with your findings. If you want to help us uncover more of the suppressed history of the old world, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The truth is hiding in plain sight. You just have to know where to look.